Hello and welcome to, well, this isn't my show, but it is about something truly shocking. It's about how the COVID-19 pandemic didn't just devastate lives, it also completely upended the global economy. And guess what? It made the rich richer and the poor poorer. Shocking, I know. Here's a statistic that'll make you spit out your drink if you're drinking one. During the first year of the pandemic, the world's billionaires, those paragons of wealth and good fortune, saw their combined net worth increase by a staggering $3.6 trillion. Meanwhile, the bottom half of the global population, those just trying to get by, experienced a collective loss of over $4 trillion. That's right, folks. While you were struggling to pay rent, the ultra-wealthy were off buying another yacht, probably one shaped like a giant middle finger. This wasn't just some random coincidence. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated the deeply ingrained inequalities that already existed. It was like someone poured gasoline on a dumpster fire of economic disparity and then just stood back and filmed it. Now, pandemics are inherently disruptive. We get it. They force businesses to close, people to stay home, and economies to sputter. But what made COVID-19 different was the scale and speed of its impact. It was like hitting the global economy with a giant pause button, only to realize that some people's lives were on fast forward while others were stuck in rewind. Suddenly, millions were out of work. Industries like tourism and hospitality were decimated. People were scared, uncertain, and struggling to make ends meet. But amidst the chaos, something else was happening. Something unexpected. While many struggled, some industries actually thrived. Tech companies, fueled by the sudden shift to remote work and online everything, saw their profits soar. E-commerce giants like Amazon became even more dominant as people, confined to their homes, turned to online shopping with a vengeance. It was a stark reminder that even in the midst of a global crisis, there are winners and losers. Let's be clear, the pandemic didn't affect everyone equally. It disproportionately impacted those who were already most vulnerable. The poor, the marginalized, and those in precarious employment situations. It was like the universe decided to play a cruel game of economic Jenga, and those at the bottom were the first to get pulled out. Low-income households, already living paycheck to paycheck, were hit hardest by job losses and income reductions. Many were forced to deplete their savings, take on debt, or rely on government assistance just to survive. Young people just starting their careers faced a bleak job market and mounting student loan debt. And let's not forget about minority communities. They were more likely to be employed in essential but low-wage jobs, putting them at higher risk of exposure to the virus. They also faced systemic barriers to healthcare and economic opportunities, further exacerbating their challenges. The pandemic didn't create these inequalities, but it sure as hell amplified them. Remember when we talked about winners and losers? Let's dive into some specific examples, shall we? Because nothing illustrates the uneven impact of the pandemic quite like comparing two industries that couldn't have been more different: technology and travel. On one hand, we have the tech industry riding high on the wave of our collective dependence on all things digital. Companies like Zoom, Microsoft, and Apple saw their valuations skyrocket as video conferencing, cloud computing, and online services became essential tools for work, education, and even socializing. On the other hand, the travel industry was absolutely hammered. Airlines were grounded, hotels stood empty, and tourism came to a screeching halt. Millions of jobs were lost, and countless businesses were forced to shut their doors, some never to reopen. It was a stark reminder that even in the 21st century, some industries are far more vulnerable to disruption than others. Section 5. The Zoom boom and the travel bust. Let's put some numbers to these stories, shall we? Because nothing screams economic disparity quite like cold, hard data. Zoom, the video conferencing platform that became synonymous with remote work and virtual happy hours, saw its revenue increase by a staggering 326% in 2020. That's not a typo. Their profits went from doing all right to swimming in a Scrooge McDuck vault of cash. Meanwhile, the global airline industry lost an estimated $138 billion in 2020. That's billion with a B, and that's just the airlines. The broader travel and tourism sector, which accounted for over 10% of global GDP before the pandemic, was brought to its knees. This wasn't just about profits and losses, though. It was about people's livelihoods. Tech workers, many of whom could work remotely, were able to keep their jobs and even thrive. But millions of travel and hospitality workers, many of whom were in low-wage face-to-face roles, were left unemployed and struggling. It was a tale of two pandemics playing out in real time. Section 6, A World Apart. Now, you might be thinking, okay, John, we get it. The pandemic was bad for some industries and good for others. But what about geographically? Did it affect everyone around the world the same way? Oh, bless your heart. You think a global pandemic would play fair? The impact of COVID-19 varied dramatically from country to country, region to region. Developed economies, with their robust social safety nets and access to vaccines, were generally able to weather the storm better than developing countries. But even within those broad categories, there were stark differences. Countries in East Asia like China and South Korea, which had experience with previous outbreaks like SARS, were able to implement swift and effective containment measures, minimizing the economic damage. On the other hand, countries in South Asia and Latin America, with their weaker healthcare systems and large informal economies, were hit particularly hard. It was a stark reminder that pandemics, like most crises, tend to exacerbate existing inequalities. Section 7, The Rich Get Richer. Remember that statistic about billionaires getting richer during the pandemic? Let's unpack that a bit, shall we? Because it's even more infuriating than it sounds. You see, the pandemic created the perfect conditions for the wealthy to increase their wealth. Governments around the world, desperate to stave off economic collapse, injected trillions of dollars into the financial system. Interest rates were slashed to near zero, making it cheaper than ever to borrow money. And guess who benefited most from these policies? You guessed it, the people who already had a ton of money. They were able to buy up assets like stocks and real estate at bargain prices, while everyone else was struggling to keep their heads above water. It was like the opposite of trickle-down economics. It was more like a reverse waterfall where the wealth flowed upwards, concentrating even more power and resources in the hands of the few. Section 8, A Legacy of Inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just a health crisis, it was an economic crisis, a social crisis, and its legacy will be felt for years, if not decades, to come. It exposed the fragility of our systems, the deep-seated inequalities that plague our societies, and the urgent need for a more just and equitable world. The pandemic widened the gap between the rich and the poor, leaving millions behind while a select few prospered. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of our globalized economy, the precariousness of many people's livelihoods, and the inadequacy of our social safety nets. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that we can't continue down the same path. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to simply shrug our shoulders and accept this new reality? Or are we going to demand better? Are we going to fight for a world where everyone has an equal opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances? Section 9, A Call for Action. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that the status quo is not sustainable. We can't continue to ignore the plight of the most vulnerable, the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, the systemic inequalities that permeate our societies. We need to act. And we need to act now. This isn't about charity, it's about justice. It's about creating a world where everyone has a fair shot at a decent life, where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, where everyone is valued and respected. It's about building a more equitable, more just, and more sustainable future for all. So what can we do? We can start by demanding better from our leaders. We need policies that promote economic equality, that protect workers' rights, that ensure access to quality healthcare and education for all. We need to invest in social safety nets, strengthen our public institutions, and create a more just and equitable tax system. Section 10, Building a Better Future. The COVID-19 pandemic was a tragedy, but it was also a wake-up call. It showed us that we can't take our health, our economies, or our societies for granted. It showed us that we're all interconnected and that we need to work together to create a better future for everyone. This isn't going to be easy. It's going to require a fundamental shift in our thinking, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable world. But it's a fight worth having, because the alternative, A world where the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen, where inequality reigns supreme, and where the most vulnerable are left behind is simply unacceptable. So let's get to work. Let's build a better future. A future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.